Hi everyone, Callahan here, and thanks for listening to The Mind Sculptors. If you like the content we create and want to help us keep on making it, head on over to our Patreon page. For just $2 a month, you can help support the channel and get exclusive access to our Discord server. For more information, check out the link in the description. And welcome everybody into another episode of The Mind Sculptors. I am your host, Callahan. Joining me today, one of my very good friends from here in the Lincoln community, is my good friend Phoenix. How are you doing, Phoenix?
I'm doing pretty good. We are having a little bit of snow right now, so it's cold.
Yes, it dropped like 50 degrees in a day where we are. So today, we are going to be talking. Phoenix and I are the two deck curators on the Lavinia Omen pool list, and it's a list that you've heard us talk about a little bit in the past when we were talking about Kenrith stacks and other things like that. But we are doing a episode here to give you guys some updates on the new inclusions in the list with Commander Legends coming out. But before we even get into that, well, let's talk about what the new cards are. So we'll break all of this down. But coming out of the list is Teferi, Master of Time, Negate, Verity Circle, Back to Basics, Teferi, Time Raveler, Hushbringer, Scavenger Grounds, Idyllic Tutor, yay, and Inventor's Fair. What we have replaced those cards with is Savine's Reclamation, Inspiring Statuary, Static Orb, Urza Lord High Artificer, Phantasmal Image, A Plains, Sea of Clouds, Skyclave Apparition, and Hullbreacher. So, starting us off, Phoenix, right there, specifically, this is a Commander Legends update. So talk about, for a moment, why did we decide that Hullbreacher was the way to go?
Yeah, so we already play every wheel that we can realistically get our hands on. So we play Twister, we play Windfall, we play both of those wheels, and we don't have black to play Notion Thief. Mm-hmm. And so at one point in the deck, we did actually play Narset in this spot where it was some way to weaponize our table-wide card draw. All of the times when you cast a Windfall or a Time Twister, you're casting them after you've emptied your hand and you're trying to refill. But in this case, we can use it as an offensive card, and it gives us more opportunities to actually want to cast Windfall and Time Twister.
Right. And we included that specifically because we can, one, weaponize it, but we can also catch people in other scenarios. Like, we kind of get to play Notion Thief, but that specifically cares about like making us mana. And this is something I say in the Lavinia Discord often, is we are a mana hungry deck, right? Like, we are a deck that wants as much mana as we can get our hands on. So anytime that we can have an effect that, one, stops our opponents from drawing extra cards, but two, gives us extra mana, is really a big deal.
Yeah, and I think a big thing to note with Hullbreacher is that, unlike Smothering Tithe, which we're already playing, it actually does stop the draw as well as getting us a trigger or a treasure.
Right.
And so that's a lot better for us, where we're a deck that doesn't necessarily get ahead on cards a lot of the time.
Right. So anything that we can do to help us get ahead is super helpful. There are two other big cards in the set that we considered, didn't make it into the list, however. One of them was Jeweled Lotus. You didn't like it for our list, and we're in a very strange position because the rest of CADH, right? sees this card and we're like, oh, sweet, it turbos us out. It doesn't change our turn one like at all.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue that it's a Lotus Petal and you play Lavinia on turn one more often, but we are attempting for a turn one Lavinia anyways. So,
right.
And then a lot of the times you want that colored mana up for something that you're interacting with swords or a counterspell.
Right. And it's strange.
I just think it works out a little bit worse than any other deck.
Right. And it doesn't make a big enough impact in our list. And where I saw it be in testing it, that I saw it be the most impactful, was later in the game after Lavinia had been like removed once or twice. It did make it easier to recast her. But kind of how I feel about that is if we're at that point in the game, we're not doing great anyway.
Yeah. If we're casting Lavinia for the third or fourth time, we're probably, in that case, I would assume chump blocking something big hitting us and in a lot of trouble.
Right. The other card that we did talk about is Keeper of the Accord. And ultimately, we did cut Verge Rangers and we put it in the maybe board. But ultimately, with Keeper of the Accord, what was it that we kind of landed on for that?
So it's a card that sits at 4 mana, which is a lot for CDH. We play a lot of spells in this deck, which are also a lot of mana for CDH. And a lot of those spells, all of those spells actually, do a lot more than Keeper of the Accord does. Keeper of the Accord catches us up when we're behind, but it doesn't proactively do anything for us.
Mm-hmm.
It makes some creatures when we have less creatures. It makes some land when we have land, or don't have as much land as other people, but it doesn't do anything to get us ahead when we're already paying a really steep price for it.
Right. So those are the 3 cards from the new set that we really looked at and talked about. And, you know, as you can see, Hullbreacher ultimately was the one that got in. A couple of cards that people might be surprised to see. Actually, I think there's several. Well, one right away that I feel like is fairly obvious. Phantasmal Image is absurdly good, right?
Yeah, I mean, as more and more people are playing Dockside Extortionist related decks, it sure would be nice if we could play Dockside Extortionist. So let's just include our copy here.
Well, and I mean, we play tested a game where I was on this particular build of the deck, and you were playing Corvold. We had somebody that was playing Storm, and then I forget what the 4th deck at the table was. And you had brought your Corvold out and attacked me that turn, and you passed the turn to me. I Gilded Drake the Corvold, right? Passed the turn around. On your end step before the turn goes back to me, the Storm player flashes in a Notion Thief, and I draw from the top of my deck a Phantasmal Image, and I Phantasmal Imaged the Gilded Drake and got the Notion Thief and was able to keep using the Corvold. So it's one of those cards that really just is able to fill a lot, like tick a lot of check marks for us.
Yeah, it definitely is the best card on the battlefield. It always is the best creature on the battlefield. It always comes in as the best creature on the battlefield. There's a lot of situations where we can abuse it too with Gilded Drake and some of the new includes with Savine's Reclamation and things like that, where we can double up on effects, or we can replay this and get a little bit more spicy.
Right. One of the other speaking of Savine's Reclamation, what was it that explain for everybody, what was it for us that made us go, yeah, let's go ahead and play this?
So I put together, and you did as well, we went pretty deep on ways to make Rule of Law work. Notably, we're not including Rule of Law, but we are including some of those cards that we play tested to try and make Rule of Law work.
Mm-hmm.
a card that we would love to play but can't necessarily afford for the exact same reason as the Keeper of the Accord, just because of the mana cost, is Sun Titan. We would love to play Sun Titan.
Mm-hmm.
Get back lands, get back hate pieces, get back a Dan after it's been killed, and replay that into a lock. Savine's Reclamation has the same effect as Sun Titan, but on a spell. And so it comes down a lot sooner for us. And then the additional bonus is the flashback is castable during a knowledge pool lock.
Right.
So if we play our Archon of Emeria, which is the only rule of law still in the deck, we can still play Savine's Reclamation and get something out of our graveyard.
Right. And Archon of Emeria stays in the deck as the only rule of law, and that is because it is, one, a creature, but two, it has some form of evasion that lets us close the game out if we get that lock through.
And yeah, just to speak to some of the rule of law issues we had since we're going in that direction. The one big difference between Archon of Emeria and the actual Arcane Laboratory and rule of law is that it's a creature. So if you land the lock and no one can play any spells anymore except for their commanders, the Archon of Emeria can block. And so at that point, the lock is broken if we have cast Lavinia for ourselves.
Right.
And so people can't attack us, but we can then try and attack them with a 2/3 and pass the table around, etc.
Right. So, and that's because there was one version of the deck where we were playing all of them, right? We were playing Eidolon, Deafening Silence, Rule of Law. I don't think I ever put Arcane Laboratory into the experimental list. But we tried that, where we tried to go kind of like the Kenrith Stacks route. But the difference is that Kenrith really out of the zone gives you a lot of ways to break the parity, and we just don't have that way to break parity with Lavinia. And as much as we would love to be playing Rule of Law in this particular meta, we're going to continue to recommend only playing Archon of Emeria.
Yeah. The only other one to consider would probably be the Eidolon of Rhetoric, if it is good. There is, of course, a concern that the creatures attacking you aren't big enough to kill the Eidolon of Rhetoric. Right. And so you can't actually get it off of the board after you've played your Lavinia.
The other thing to keep in mind, too, with Archon is it's not only a Rule of Law effect, it also has that Thalia, that newer Thalia ability where non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. And for our game plans, that slows the pace of the game much farther down, and that works in our advantage.
Yep, exactly.
Moving on to some of the other newer includes, Skyclave Apparition was a card we didn't include in the Zendikar Rising update, but is now in the update. We've talked about this card a lot, and I feel like for me, the aha moment was when Mike Levine with Heliod was talking about it on CDH Cast and the Heliod list that he won. What was it? Oktoberfest with. So just kind of talk more for me and explain to people why now we're moving on to Skyclave Apparition.
Yeah, so I mean, our initial reading of the card was, oh, that's really good. And then we read the second half of it and, oh, that makes a big body. That might just kill us. It turns out that, oh, that's really good is just good enough most of the time.
Yeah.
The second, we were definitely worried about the body size if we hit something 4 CMC, 3 CMC, and that just being bigger than Lavinia when we tried to lock with Lavinia.
Right. And what ended up happening was it turned out that we were using it on 1 to 2 CMC things way more often. Things that it went after were stuff like Mystic Remora or Mana Dorks, or things that kind of evened the playing field, so to speak. And those are cards that we have no problem block. You know what I mean? Like we don't mind a 1/1 coming at us. So Skyclave is just really good universal removal. And then when you pair that with Phantasmal Image being in the deck, we're able to take advantage of it even more.
Yeah, and then if you notice a theme with all these cards that came in, you can Savine's Reclamation this back, and it's another piece of removal.
And like you said, the theme is we're trying to get that consistency, and trying to reach that consistency, and that cards that have what's the word I'm looking for? Some sort of like they're able to layer on top of each other to make the consistency better.
Synergy.
Thank you.
Let's throw some buzzwords in here.
Words are hard, man. So one of the new includes that I am incredibly high on. So there's two that I'm very high on. I'm going to start with probably the least spiciest of the two. Is Urza Lord High Artificer. So the reason we're including Urza in this list, and this was something I kind of came on with talking through about it with Cobblepot, was, if we have this out during a lock, we can just cast spells through Urza's ability and cast spells through the lock. This is a parity breaker. This is huge.
Yeah, and that's not even to mention that it makes mana and that it makes a big beefy dude.
Because, I mean, we play, holy crap, how many artifacts do we play? We play 20 artifacts in the list.
Yeah. That construct can get really big, and in a lock, we need something that's really big sometimes.
Right. The one thing that Urza really allows us to get to play too is Static Orb. And that's something that you and I were kind of not totally sure on 100%. But in playtesting, it was consistent enough to be worth including because of the Urza.
Yeah. And as a straight replacement for Back to Basics, it is something that we can break parity on with Urza, and another one of your new includes. And it's easier for us to break parity on than Back to Basics.
Right.
It is a little bit more restrictive on what it shuts down, and it is something that doesn't affect us quite as much as Back to Basics. A lot of the times Back to Basics did hit us about as much as it hit everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we included Static Orb for that reason. My favorite card that we're including is the spiciest of them, and it's my personal least played card in all of EDH, is Inspiring Statuary. If you're unfamiliar with the card, it is a 3-mana artifact from Aether Revolt. And what it says is non-artifact spells you cast have Improvise. And if you don't know what Improvise is, it's on War of Invention. It's Convoke, but with artifacts. So a couple of things with this card. One of the things that's really huge for our list, right, is the advancement of the game with artifacts, and that really gives us a lot of advantage. Because of the type of deck we're on, we don't get to play dorks. We don't get to play some of these things that help push other people ahead, like black for tutors. So we have to leverage the artifacts that we have to our advantage. So anytime somebody comes in with a Null Rod or a Stony Silence or a Collector Oof, it's a bad time. What this card does is twofold. One, it lets us leverage Static Orb and Winter Orb to our advantage if Urza is not on the battlefield. It also acts as a secondary Baral in that instance. The other aspect of it is if a Null Rod is on the battlefield, we can still use our artifacts as a way of casting non-artifact spells. And that is huge. So it doesn't take us, a Null Rod doesn't take us out of the game anymore.
Yeah, and especially with the Urza too, we are a lot more resistant to Null Rod effects.
Right. And
we're not on play land and pass and hope that no one interacts with us.
Right. Well, and that was part of the overall theme you can kind of see with the list and what we're adding is we're really trying to play more proactive pieces that advance our game plan more effectively than we were before. So if you want to talk, Jeremy, we took out a lot of stuff. Starting with Idyllic Tutor, explain for people what the rationale is for taking out Idyllic Tutor.
Well, actually, let me start with the least sexy change, which is the lands.
Okay.
Which, pretty simply, we took out 2 colorless lands and added 2 colored lands.
Yeah.
That's about it. There's not much to it. It's just those 2 colorless lands have been the worst 2 that we've seen as we've played the deck. And then we added 2 colored sources, so plains and a sea of clouds. But moving on to the Idyllic Tutor. So one of the big things is Opposition Agent.
Right. So
Opposition Agent is going to drive CEDH and be the thing that people are playing around. One black and 2 colorless is going to be threatening.
Correct.
And we really don't want to be paying 3 mana on our main phase into a single black and 2 colorless. It's very scary and very slow into that type of card. And it's also been a card that we've been wanting to cut for a long time, but we just haven't because our color restrictions.
And now I feel with the additions, we're kind of able to compensate for the lack of tutors. I think the only tutors we're running now are War of Invention, Mystical Tutor, and Enlightened Tutor. Yeah, those are the only 3 that we're really playing. And I personally think that puts us in a pretty good spot, just because of the fact that, overall, if we rely too hard on tutors, especially going into how the meta is going to be looking, it is going to hurt us in the long run. So if we can play effectively without those tutor effects, which in testing we were able to do, we should be able to look pretty good going into this new meta game that's coming up. With the new meta game coming, there are some other things, kind of more of a less, again, more on the not sexy exclusions, but we did cut Verity Circle and Hushbringer, and those have been the 2 most underwhelming cards in our experience.
Yeah, and just to speak to Hushbringer, it is very good against Oracle, but we haven't been seeing, at least in our meta, we haven't been seeing as much graveyard deck. We've been seeing a lot more Turbo Nas and trying to accelerate the pace of the game and play a little bit faster. And then some of the inclusions that we include like Skyclave, do things on entering the battlefield. Urza does things on entering the battlefield.
Right.
Phantasmal Image usually copies something that does something when it enters the battlefield.
Right. Yeah, and Hushbringer just, I just don't feel like it does enough. It's and this comes back to what I mentioned earlier, where we're trying to be more proactive with our game plan. And Hushbringer is the antithesis of a proactive game plan.
Yeah, and I do think it's good enough in certain metas to still hang around in the maybe board, but it is definitely not proactive.
And that is something to, make sure that we are saying is none of these cards are leaving the list necessarily. They're all moving to the maybe board. These are all cards that, depending on budget, depending on your meta game, that you can still consider. But as far as the budget list and the going into, kind of the general competitive EDH meta game, these are the cards that we recommend playing. 2 of those cuts were some of our Planeswalkers, and they were both Teferis, the 2 newest Teferis, Master of Time and Time Raveler. And the unfortunate thing is cutting Teferi Time Raveler is cutting one of the lock pieces. But kind of explain for people what it was that we kind of decided with Teferi.
Generally, the issue is, so one of the worst things about Teferi Time Raveler, it does have a negative ability to protect itself, but it doesn't really do very much when it's out on the battlefield, except for bounce one thing and draw one card. And then it is very vulnerable to dorks, things on the battlefield. And as a deck that doesn't play a ton of creatures, it is very hard to keep alive.
Right. And it often opens us up to where if somebody wants to do a Naz on your end step, you are now the only one. Well, I guess you can't really do that. If somebody wants to do a Naz on their turn, you are the only one at the table who can do anything about it.
Yeah, it definitely makes all of the interaction. You have to have all of the interaction at the table if you're the one playing Teferi out.
Correct. And Teferi Master of Time was just kind of too expensive for what it does.
Yeah, it's 4 mana for repeated loots, and sometimes protecting itself from a creature. The ultimate is good, but it just is to hit for us in our deck, or exact same reasoning as the smaller Teferi. We don't play a ton of creatures, so it's often times that we'll have to use a minus in a turn cycle. And at that point, we probably won't ever get to the ultimate.
Right. So we took those out. JTMS and Hero of Dominaria are still in. They're still really, 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 really good. I cannot preach the goodness of those cards enough. And those cards also get a little bit easier to play when you have Inspiring Statuary, because now some of your maybe more your stacks pieces, I mean, you know, even I'm trying to see here, try to look at my list. Your Curse Totem is now your Juntu Stakes is now a mana rock, and it makes those things a lot easier to cast. So I think a lot of our mana issues are starting to kind of figure themselves out, just through progression and playing a little bit more. And the last thing really to touch on with the cut is negate. And it really just came down to we run a lot of counters already, and we very rarely don't have blue and a white up for Dovin's Veto. So we kind of opted to scale back on some of the counters we were playing. Specifically because we were running into this issue where there were a lot of times that we would have counters, but nothing to counter. And we wanted, again, I'm going to come back to this over and over again, to be more proactive.
Yeah, and getting more spells in the deck that progress our game plan versus spells that we're holding on to and maybe not getting the mana to cast by not being proactive is definitely the direction that the update is trying to go.
Right. Well, we've really covered a lot. I mean, a couple final thoughts. I mean, what are your final thoughts with where the deck stands right now?
I think the thing that I'm evaluating going into the future is how much we might need the 1 mana counter spells versus some of the more expensive things like Mana Drain, which has been getting cut from a lot of lists. Definitely not getting cut from ours, but something like Delay getting replaced with a 1 mana counter, something like Counterspell getting replaced with a 1 mana counter, specifically probably Miscast or Spell Pierce, depending on how much faster.
Spell Snare would also be in that.
Yeah, depending on how much faster things end up being, or if they're maybe slower with Opposition Agent, depending on how metas start kind of shaking out. We'll just really have to see on if we need to lighten up our mana pip intensity on counterspells or not.
Right. Which overall might be fine for us. Another card that I'm also testing for people to keep their eyes kind of on is I'm going to suggest people try Snap. I'm not quite to a point where I'm ready to put it in the main list, mostly because I don't know what I'd take out for it. But I have been playtesting Snap. It's good. I just don't know what I'd want to take out for it. And I've tried a variety of things, and I really want to see what the meta does before I can really cut anything else right now to put in Snap.
Yeah, and Snap is definitely at its best when you can, as well as counting it as removal, count it as a way to replay one of your own spells. And we don't have a ton of things. We're getting more now, but we don't have a ton of things that we really want to play 3 or 4 times or repeatedly get a dockside, something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the big nice synergy with it is Skyclave Apparition and that card work really well together, because it basically pays for most of the second Skyclave.
Yeah, and it also makes it so that those triggers are separated, so you wouldn't end up with a illusion on the battlefield off of the first Skyclave.
Right. So there's things to keep in mind, and like I said, so that's a card. Like I said, I want to include it. It's in my experimental list, but I don't know what to take out for it. I'll say this much: if you're playing on a budget list and you're not in a proxy friendly environment, and you have to find something for Tabernacle, this is one thing that I said in my video I did with Braden on CDH Cast, is don't consider Tabernacle a land, because it's not. It is effectively a spell that we don't pay anything for. So if you need to find a replacement for that, Snap might be one of those cards to put in that slot.
Yeah, maybe a one mana land.
Right. So with that, that concludes kind of where we're at. Like I said, we're trying to really move this to be more proactive, especially as the metagame shifts. But we really feel like we're in a good position overall. Our testing has been positive. Our win rate is right about where it should be, at that 20-ish% marker. So if we were posting lower win rates, we would not feel so good about where the list is at.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that we can't really jump on the rule of law train. I would love to, but so far, only being able to cast a 2/2 once you hit rule of law and a knowledge pool is not great.
Right. I will recommend that if you want to be on the rule of law train, I would definitely recommend going back and listening to our Kenra Stacks episode, where we discuss in depth with Cobblepot, Pongo, and Phoenix what that deck looks like and all the different variations of it, because that's really the deck that is effectively taking advantage of rule of law right now. So with that, it's been great having you. Love having you on the show, Phoenix, and we'll make sure to have you on sometime soon.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, this has been the Mind Sculptors. I'm Callahan, and I will see you next time.